Welcome back to week 2 of virtual school. I'm very proud of all you guys for the hard work you did last week. This week we are going to finish our content, finish Unit 9. We'll have reached the end of AP Psychology coursework as laid out by the AP College Board. I'm really proud of you guys. This year you've worked really hard, and I wish we could all be together in person to have this last week. But we are doing the best we can, and thank you for being flexible. So let's jump into it. Today we're going to talk about group behavior. In particular, being in a group, how does that influence our behavior? And we know in certain ways it influences our behavior, and it influences the way we think. Okay, so group behavior, we're talking about behavior when other people are around. So I'm just going to run through some different vocabulary words. I'm going to run through some examples, and there will be a fun activity for you to earn points today that you can upload into Focus. All right, social facilitation. Social facilitation is improved performance on simple or well-learned tasks. So basically, something that you do well, you are going to do better when you're doing it in front of a group of people. So you might think about athletes, right? And some of you guys, a lot of you guys play sports, or you perform dances or cheerleading or something like that. You tend to perform better when people are watching you, right? So you might practice great in practice, but then you elevate your game when the crowd is there cheering you on. Okay, so why? Here's a good review for the AP exam. And in fact, I think my 4B had it on their last FRQ. Arousal theory. Okay, so remember, arousal, not sexual arousal, but when we are entertained and we are energized, right? Yerkes-Dodson law says that if we have a little bit of arousal, we get peak performance. So remember, too little arousal, we don't perform as well. Too much arousal, we get too nervous, we get too overstimulated, we don't perform as well. But when we hit that ultimate level of arousal, we have peak performance. And that's what that Yerkes-Dodson law says. Remember, it married arousal theory with performance. And that explains social facilitation, okay? If you do something well, you tend to do it even better when people are watching you. Now, the opposite can also be true, and that's where we get to social inhibition. What you find very difficult to do, or something that maybe you feel uneasy about, you tend to do worse when people are watching you. So if you are very uncomfortable speaking in public, doing a class presentation can really be a struggle, and you might not do so well. You guys are all learning to drive, okay? That's something new. You're not great drivers yet, even though you think you might be, you're really not. So taking your driver's test, you might find that maybe you mess up a little bit more because somebody's watching you. So social facilitation, you do things you already do well better in front of a crowd, and social inhibition, things that you don't do well, you tend to do worse than normal in front of a crowd. Social loafing. Social loafing is the classic group project problem. Social loafing is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling their efforts toward obtaining a common goal. So, given a group project by your teacher, you all know the students that don't put in the weight. And in fact, you yourself might be honest, well, if we all pool our resources, I don't have to work as hard as I normally do. And that not having to work as hard, not putting in your best effort, that's social loafing. De-individuation, we talked about briefly when we talked about the Zimbardo prison experiment. De-individuation is you lose your sense of self-awareness when you're in a crowd. You lose your sense of self-awareness when you have a mask on. So remember, in the Zimbardo prison experiment, the guards were wearing really big glasses and they were in a costume. Well, they sort of lost their self into the role. And when people get in crowds, we can also tend to lose our sense of self-awareness, and we might be prone to do something we wouldn't normally do. I'm going to provide a link to a Jaguars football game. The Jaguars football game, it was called Bottlegate. And I want you to watch the video and you'll see what happens. It's the end of a game and people are upset and they start throwing bottles onto the field. Okay, it's a giant crowd at a Jaguars game and they all start throwing their water bottle, or not their water bottle, their other bottles onto the field. Now, if they were alone, okay, and they were singled out, that person, those people would not have thrown the bottles because they would have been noticed. They would have been all by themselves. People would have been able to pick them out. But when they were lost in this big mass of crowd in the stadium and everybody was doing it, okay, they lost their sense of self-awareness and they started to behave like they wouldn't normally behave on a one-on-one situation. Another example of de-individuation that was on the AP exam last year on the FRQ was for Halloween. Okay, when the kids put on their costumes, when you guys go out and put on your costumes, you know that people don't know who you are with that mask on. You might behave in a way that you would not normally behave if somebody could see who you are. We could take that a little further and go to the Ku Klux Klan, right? They wore masks. Nobody could see who they were. And they behaved in a way that they would not have behaved if somebody was seeing them. We know that those Ku Klux Klan members were neighbors. They were pastors. They were upstanding members of the community. Had their faces been shown, they wouldn't have done some of those horrible things that they did. But we can blame that kind of looseness of morals, that loss of self-awareness on this concept of de-individuation. Mr. Duncan and I were at the University of Florida when we won the back-to-back national championships in basketball. And I remember after the first one or the second one, we went down kind of like to the like the little town center that we could walk to, and everybody went right next to campus, and everybody was just like, crazy. You wouldn't be crazy alone, but you're crazy in a crowd. And that's just another example of de-individuation. All right, groupthink. Groupthink occurs when a desire for harmony, so peace, in decision-making overrides realistic appraisal of alternatives. So what happens is you have a group of people who doesn't want to disagree with one another. They value harmony in the group. And so they end up kind of not saying what they really think. And bad decisions can be made. So for example, you have a leader. It happens a lot with presidents, okay? They tend to surround themselves with yes men, people that are not going to disagree with them. And so when the president is faced with a decision, because they don't want to go against what the president has said, all the people in the room have a tendency to exhibit groupthink. They say, oh yes, that sounds great. And they don't speak up and say, well, but maybe that's not going to work. A huge example, and this is where kind of the concept came from, was when John F. Kennedy was president and he did the Bay of Pigs invasion. I think some of you guys, I don't know which course, I remember from last year, my students had heard about the Bay of Pigs in one of your history courses. So groupthink came out of that. There's a link to the video in your assignment for you to watch the little video on groupthink in the Bay of Pigs and John F. Kennedy. We live in a very, in a time where our leader has a bunch of yes men, and sometimes, right, when we surround ourselves with people who disagree with us because they don't want to disagree with us, then maybe we don't make the best decisions. So groupthink can be overcome if a leader will surround himself with people who are going to play devil's advocate, and that sort of will go away. Groupthink is highest when there's a highly cohesive group. Groupthink is highest when there's a very distinct and strong leader. Groupthink is highest when the group is isolated from other influences. So that's when you have a bunch of like-minded people. Okay, you might not make the best decision because you're not taking input from other different groups. Groupthink is highest when there's time pressure or there's a lot of stress in the decision, and also when the leader has his or her mind made up. All right, group polarization. Group polarization is the enhancement of a group's prevailing inclinations through discussion within the group. So what happens with group polarization? You have a group of people who is like-minded, and they start discussing a topic. When they are done discussing the topic, those people feel more convicted than they did when they entered in the discussion, because the group came together and they all talked about this thing, and they became more invested. They became more polarized. We live in a very polarized world, right? We have the Republicans and we have the Democrats, and the Republicans are so Republican and the Democrats are so Democrat that the middle people kind of get left out. And what is happening is you could blame that on group polarization, because these like-minded people are coming together and they're moving to the extremes. And what's missing is the middle. The internet is not good for group polarization. We've talked about the internet before. You can go on the internet and you can find anything to talk about, anything that will confirm your beliefs. I've talked about confirmation bias. The internet is an echo chamber. So you go in there, you go into these groups, they're all talking about anti-vaxxing. Well, you become more convicted. You move to a more extreme position than you were prior to entering into that conversation, and that is group polarization. Group polarization, what can combat it is the minority influence. Okay, so minority influence occurs when a very confident and very persistent minority group influences the decision by the whole group. So if you have a little minority opinion, if you just keep at it and keep at it and keep at it, you can reduce that group polarization. All right. Conflict and conflict resolution is where we're going to end today. So conflict is a perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. You guys know conflict. There's war. Political groups fight each other. Fighting with your parents or your siblings. That, you know, conflict. Conflict is anger. You disagree. You don't see eye to eye on ideas or goals or actions, what to do, how to do it. So how do these conflicts come about? We're going to talk about a classic dilemma. It's called the prisoner's dilemma. So I'm going to read it to you, and then Dawson and Avery are going to give their thoughts about how they would solve the dilemma. And then I want you in the comments to tell me what you would do. So here is the classic prisoner's dilemma, and you can see where conflict would arise. All right. Imagine that prisoner A and prisoner B were charged with a crime and detained separately. So they were kept apart, to different cells. And each has the chance to give a confession. Neither prisoner knows what the other one will choose to do. There are several possible outcomes. Number one, if only one prisoner confesses, the confessor is set free, but the non-confessor serves a 3-year sentence. Option number two, if neither prisoner confesses, both prisoners will serve a 1-year sentence. And option number three, if both confess, then both serve 2 years. So we have our opinion number one of what Avery would do.
If I were a prisoner Number one, I would not say anything so the other person can get out if they speak.
Oh, all right. So Avery is a self-sacrificer because she's super nice and sweet.
And if you do it and you think the other person won't do it, then you have to do it longer.
Oh, all right. Let's hear what Dawson has to say. What option Dawson would say?
So, what's the one that's the one term?
You would betray your friend.
Okay, yeah, betray your friend, because I'm not like Avery and I don't really,
So Dawson would
I might
betray
have followed
his friend.
his lead and gone into prison, so that's what he gets. So, yeah.
All right, so that's what he gets. So Dawson would betray. Avery would stay quiet. So, what do you think? Put it in the comments. Would you keep quiet? Would you betray the other prisoner in the hopes that you get off scot-free and they have to serve 3 years? Or would you think you confess and take the risk that the other guy's confessing and then you have 2 years? All right, classic version of the prisoner's dilemma, and it also illustrates conflict, okay? The conflict that arises between an individual's and a collective interest, right? We have two kind of things going on here. In many scenarios, so think about limited resources, okay? Limited natural resources. Incentives encourage individual people or countries to make self-serving choices. So Dawson made the self-serving choice. His choice was to confess, okay? Even though the broader community, so your friend, your other prisoner friend, right, would benefit from cooperation. If you both stayed silent, if you both abstained from using the oil or cutting down the trees, right, then everybody would benefit. You would have a reduced sentence, you would have a beautiful forest, you would have clean water, clean air. So that is the prisoner's dilemma. It illustrates where the conflict arises. Are we following our own self-interest, or can we act cooperatively for the betterment of the group? So here we come to an idea, a concept called social trap. A social trap is a situation which conflicting parties, by each pursuing their own self-interest rather than the good of the group, become caught in mutually destructive behavior. And the prisoner's dilemma illustrates that, right? If they both looked out for themselves, they're both going to serve a longer prison unless other than cooperating. So I have uploaded a document that is your assignment that is a social trap. So if you look for the assignment for lesson 4, go ahead and fill it out. I'm asking you not to talk to your classmates about it. I want to run a true little test here to see how your answers would be. All right, moving on. How do we see our enemies? Okay, so we have conflict. We have people, right, that we spar with. We have enemies. How do we see them? There's this idea, it's called mirror image perception, okay, that when we view our enemies, right, we see them as bad and we see ourselves as good even if we're doing the same behavior. Okay, so each side in a conflict sees itself as ethical and peaceful and see the other person as evil and aggressive. So for example, torture, okay? If our enemies would use torture against our U.S. soldiers, we would think they were awful and horrible. However, we know, okay, that we as a American CIA soldiers, whatever, have used torture on people. And we justify saying, well, they're the bad guys. We need to get information to keep us safe. Same behavior, right? But when they do it, it's bad. When we do it, we perceive ourselves as ethical. There is a very interesting study. It's called the Muzaffer Sharif Robbers Cave Study. And it examined what happened when they created conflict between two groups of boys. I have provided a link for you. It's a 5-minute recap of the experiment. It is really good. It's so good, I'm gonna let you watch that. But what happened in a nutshell, they created conflict between two groups of boys by having them compete for limited resources. So the resources were like prizes, like pocket knives and stuff like that. So they created these two little teams. The teams would have to compete against each other for the one prize. And it caused these boys to really hate each other. And they started doing really mean tricks and that sort of thing. And these were white, middle class, supposedly, clean cut, come from good home boys. And they started doing really horrible things when they had to compete for limited resources. Now, how did they fix that? They fixed it. They made these boys come back together by creating a job that they had to do together. Okay, one of them was fixing the water tank so they would all have fresh, clean water at the camp. Creating that thing that they had to work together, that's called a superordinate goal. Superordinate goal is a shared goal that overrides differences among people. So even though these boys' teams, they were really at each other's throats, they were doing really mean things to each other, when they had to work together, they were able to kind of overcome that conflict and work things out. That is a superordinate goal. And you think about, right now, we have the whole world. We don't all get along with everybody in the world, but we're all trying to figure out how to beat this virus. And so maybe we could view the virus as a way we could all come together and work together and kind of reduce some of the conflict we have with other people. There's one other idea called GRIT. It's GRIT. It's all capital, stands for Graduated and Reciprocated Initiatives Intention Reduction. And this is conflict resolution on the big scale. So this would be when two countries are in conflict and it's escalating and it's dangerous. They can employ what's called GRIT, Graduated and Reciprocated Initiatives Intention Reduction. And it is a strategy designed to decrease international tension. So how this works is one country, right? Escalation is building and one country says, all right, I'll offer a little olive branch. Okay, I'll come down a little. And then the other country said, all right, I'll come down a little. And then this country comes back and says, okay, I won't do that anymore. And this country says, okay, I'll match that. And so it reduces little by little olive branches, little concessions come back down. We see this a lot, especially a couple years ago when we were dealing with North Korea. I remember North Korea, might not even be a couple years. It feels like years when we've been doing this virus. But when North Korea was launching the things and Trump got all mad and it was like, are we going to go to war? And then all of a sudden, right, we all start doing little concessions and we bring the tensions back down. So that is it for conflict resolution. Again, I want you to look at the Bay of Pigs groupthink video. I want you to look at the Mustafar Sharif video to see the Robbers Cave. It's a really interesting study. Robbers Cave is a national park or a state park. And I want you to look at the Bottle Gate for de-individuation. And don't forget the little assignment and try not to talk to each other. It will be fun. All right. Thank you guys very much. Have a good one.